Since the time of the occultist R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, there has been a story that the Sphinx is much, much older than we had previously thought. In this episode, the first episode in the course Western History from an Egyptian Perspective, we are going to explore the history of the Sphinx and try to get to the bottom of some of the layers of literary forgery, nationalism, and lies that have coded the story of the Sphinx and its apparent age. Fringe geologists claimed that there were weathering patterns on the Sphinx, convinced that it was up to 10,000 years old. Egyptologists dismissed these claims as pseudoscience. But the legend has continued to inspire fringe theorists online, especially in the occult, who are convinced that Egyptian civilization must be much older than scholars have been letting on. Chief among these is Graham Hancock. Hancock claims that the Sphinx is that old, and that Egyptian civilization emerged from an ancient Atlantean civilization, which existed millennia ago, and seeded the world with their advanced technology. The idea is attractive. It must be admitted that human civilization is probably much older than we used to understand. And every year, new discoveries are made, which pushes further back the dates for some of our great achievements. It's also a comforting idea because it reinforces the notion that all of this has happened before. We know that time is in some sense cyclical, and the belief that there have been civilizations which resemble ours in the past before, with technologies similar to our own, is reassuring. That they might have combined these ancient technologies with a greater spiritual wisdom seems self-evident. But the problem with this story is that we've left out one important ingredient in our narrative, what the Egyptians actually said and believed. The Egyptians were a deeply spiritual people whose entire life was conducted around a participation with the mythological world of the cosmos. But our narrative about Atlanteans and ancient spiritual wisdom actually has more to do with ourselves than it has anything to do with them. It's a bit like a stereotype about the past. Let's say you've never been to China, and everything you know about the country you've learned from Hollywood. You're convinced that all Chinese people practice kung fu and have access to the wisdom of ancient masters. You will probably get away with having this silly, stereotypical view of China if you never meet an actual Chinese person. But the moment you do, you'll find that most people in China are just people, like people from anywhere else. This is not to say that there are not parts of Chinese culture which possess deep spiritual wisdom and have value that we can all learn from. It's not to say that there might not even have been great spiritual masters who emerged in China in the past, like there have been in every nation. But if your picture of China is kung fu, you're living in a stereotypical fantasy world you have constructed for your own enjoyment, and not engaging productively with any of the people of China. This is the case of Graham Hancock's ideas about Egypt, except with an added twist. The nation of ancient Egypt has been colonized and transformed beyond recognition, so there is no way you will ever meet a real ancient Egyptian priest that you can have a conversation with. The past is completely inaccessible to us. This means that you can make up whatever kung fu image of Egypt you want, and there will never be anyone who points out to you that it's really your image that you created about your ego and your place in the world, selfishly, using someone else's story. The reason why this is a problem is that it's disrespectful to the dead. It is also very, very sad, because if you look at the Egyptian monuments, much of their religion and culture was dedicated to preserving the memory of the dead in a series of sacred rituals. But every day, we casually disrespect these people's traditions, ripping open their tombs, putting their bodies on display as curiosity objects, tearing apart their most sacred treasures. And the added insult to injury is that we use the image of their culture to tell a pack of lies that suit our own purposes, whether that be Egyptologists who are logical positivists, Afrocentrists who wish to use Egypt to promote a pan-African narrative, or occultists who are seeking for the secret lore of Egypt and in the process ignore Egypt's actual culture. But what did the Egyptians actually believe? Is it true that the Sphinx could be that old? We are not going to dismiss the possibility outright, but rather than trying to reach a conclusion of what we would like to be the answer, because it may fit the vision of the past which most conforms to our biases, we are going to do our best to let the Egyptians speak for themselves by looking at texts which they wrote, the last remnant of their culture. It's easy for skeptics to dismiss the claim that the Sphinx is 10,000 years old. The biggest argument for it comes from the claim that the bands on the Sphinx represent water erosion. We know the Sphinx was repaired at one point in its history. We can see that the head is much better preserved than the body. There seems to be weathering on the body as opposed to the head. You can see it in the form of the horizontal bands that run across the body of the Sphinx. How did those get there? People who believe in the deep antiquity of the Sphinx say that these bands come from water erosion. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was a green savanna like we find in other parts of Africa. Back then, the area which is now Egypt was covered in constant rainfall and greenery. No geologist or climatologist would deny that this is true. Proponents of the theory argue that the horizontal bands on the Sphinx come from erosion in the form of rainfall, thus proving that the Sphinx must be 10,000 years old. But there's a problem with this. If you look closely at the bands on the Sphinx, you will see that they are horizontal, not vertical. When rain falls from the sky, it falls in a vertical direction. Even if the water were to form pools in certain recessions in the hollows of the Sphinx, it would have to flow off the body of the Sphinx at some point, which would leave a very different erosion pattern than the one we see here. Even someone with no knowledge of geology, looking at the Sphinx for a few minutes, and thinking about the direction which rain falls and how it pools, could see for themselves that there is no way that these horizontal bands could have been caused by water erosion. It is not physically possible. That is simply not how physics works. So what force could have caused the erosion? We actually already know the answer. It is sand. The sands of the desert are not constant, shifting in every direction. As they moved over time, it is like the Sphinx was in a giant sand blender, which literally sanded it on either side, carving these grooves into its body. We also can see why the head looks different than the body, because we know from the pictures that the head was never covered. This is a horizontal force that is much more consistent with horizontal bands than rainfall, and it is entirely possible that it happened over the course of 2,000 years of being buried in sand, rather than distant rainfall thousands of years before that. Even if there had been erosion from rainfall back then, it all would have been ground away long ago by the shifting sands. So, have we settled the debate that the Sphinx does not date back to the Green Sahara, instead dating only to the time of Khafre? Not quite. There's one problem with this. There is an Egyptian document which claims that the temple of Isis near the Sphinx was 10,000 years old, and that Khufu only repaired this temple, not built it. It turns out, the people who first started the story of the advanced age of the Sphinx were actually the Egyptians themselves. This is a document called the Inventory Stela, found at the temple to the goddess Isis at Giza. The stela has a list of 22 divine statues owned by the temple, and then claims that the temple existed before the time of Khufu. The story gets deeper. The Egyptians were known to have told the Greeks that their civilization stretched back 10,000 years, being the oldest in existence, and according to Plato, they were the people who first told the Greeks the legend of Atlantis. It would appear, if we look at what the Egyptians actually told the Greeks, that their civilization is immeasurably old, far, far older than even civilization in Babylon to the east. This is what the Egyptian priest Manetho wrote in the first book of Egyptian history written in Greek, called the Aegyptiaca. The only passages from this book which have survived include the king lists of Egypt, which Egyptologists to this day use to establish the chronology of Egyptian history. Manetho had some political motivations in writing this book. First of all, he wanted to correct the views of Herodotus, who to many Greeks was the definitive historical authority on Egypt. He claimed Herodotus gave in to stereotypes about Egypt. But he was also responding to a Babylonian writer named Berossos, who was writing his history of Babylon. Both Babylon and Egypt had recently been conquered by Alexander the Great and were trying to navigate their new position as colonies of the Greeks. Manetho wrote the Aegyptiaca to claim that Egyptian history was not only older than Greece, but also Babylon. Did Manetho inflate the age of Egypt to make it seem older than it was? It seems likely that he did. He describes a mythical reign of beings called the Shemsu Hor, who ruled Egypt for thousands of years after the gods left the earth. There has been much speculation on the internet that this was a secret society, but the meaning of those words is actually spiritual, connected to a ritual of counting cattle that was conducted by the king each year. The Babylonian king lists also have incredibly inflated numbers, where some kings ruled for hundreds of thousands of years. You can compare this to the age of Methuselah in the Bible. These numbers were often allegorical, representing concepts of sacred time and the movement of the planets, rather than the actual age of the king at his death. Manetho was not the only Egyptian priest who presented Egyptian wisdom as being incredibly ancient to the Greeks. Sanchis of Sais is said to have told Solon that all Greeks were children, and there is not even an old man among them. It would appear, by their own report, that Egyptian civilization actually was 10,000 years old. But there is a problem with this, and it comes from when we actually start to read the Egyptian texts which come from thousands of years ago. The problem is that they do not agree with the inventory stela. The biggest issue with the story that is written on the inventory stela about the reconstruction of the temple of Isis by Khufu is that at the time of Khufu, the goddess Isis did not exist. This may come as a shock to some viewers. Isis is seen as the Magna Mater, the great mother goddess of Egypt, symbol of its wisdom and deep antiquity stretching back thousands of years. How could there be a time when the goddess Isis did not exist in Egypt? To understand this, you have to understand one of the basic facts of Egyptian religion. The gods were not absolute realities, but rather metaphorical persons who represented aspects of the cosmos. Different names of different gods were popular at different times, representing different ways of making a ritual link between heaven and earth. It turns out, Isis is a goddess who only emerged very late in Egyptian history, and we know a lot about her because she became popular with Roman spiritual tourists. It was only in Roman times that Isis truly became the image of all the other goddesses of Egypt and came to represent the symbol of Egyptian religion to outsiders. If you talked to an Egyptian from the time when the pyramids were being built, they would never have heard of Isis. That is how deep and how long Egyptian history is. It was not static over those 3,000 years Manetho talks about after Mena-Narmer, the first king. There were hundreds of cultural movements which occurred. Ironically, the idea that the Temple of Isis is 10,000 years old is contradicted by the real deep antiquity of Egyptian culture. And the style of the writing in the hieroglyphs, even though it appears very old, betrays the fact that it was written later, because it uses some writing styles that only existed in late Egyptian history. It's like if I wrote a tweet in ye olde English. Everyone could see what I was going for with my tweet, but no one would think that I was Shakespeare. The motivation for the priests telling this lie about the antiquity of Egypt was probably that they were a culture that was being colonized by Greece. Lacking real military or state power in the last years of Egyptian civilization, they needed a way to protect their cultures from outsiders so that it did not get perverted and lost. So they inflated the age of their temples and turned the hieroglyphs into a secret script that very few people could understand. This protected their cultural knowledge and helped keep Egyptian wisdom alive. Unfortunately, even with these efforts of a colonized culture to protect itself, they were eventually overrun by the Greeks and Romans, ultimately collapsing under the twin forces of Christianity and then Islam. The lies they told about time were to protect their own culture. But the story of the inventory stela would live on, long after the Egyptian language had ceased to be spoken. Europeans would inherit an idea of Egypt stretching back tens of thousands of years, and it is this image which would inform their picture of the country. This image would even influence the formation of Egyptology. But before we go on to that story, there is another stela that talks about the reconstruction of the Sphinx, the Dream Stela. While we may have no evidence that the Temple of Isis ever existed at the time of Khufu, because Isis herself did not exist yet, there is evidence that the Sphinx was repaired by a certain king at one point in Egyptian history. But it occurred more than 1,000 years after the time of Khufu, in the time of Thutmose IV. This story is immortalized on the Dream Stela, a document written in stone that rests between the paws of the Sphinx. It turns out we do not need to speculate about water erosion because the history was written down. The story of the Dream Stela tells about how Thutmose IV went and incubated in Memphis to receive a vision from a god upon taking his throne. Incubation is a process whereby a devotee of a god would go to sleep in a temple and wait for a dream from that god. Thutmose received a dream from Harakte, the god of the Sphinx, who instructed him to repair the statue near the necropolis of his ancestors, and then his reign would be blessed by that god. The Dream Stela commemorates the repair of the statue and tells this story. There is speculation that Thutmose may have sought another divine sponsor in order to avoid having to depend upon the priesthood of the god Amun. After the expulsion of the Hyksos invaders from Egypt, the priesthood of Amun in Thebes had a great deal of power and set about transforming Egypt into an empire. Many of the struggles from the 18th dynasty between kings like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and the heretic king, who shall not be named, emerged because the institution of the royal throne was trying to counteract a conspiracy within the priesthood of Amun to take total control of the country. Ultimately, the priests won, and a few centuries later, transformed Upper Egypt into a theocracy ruled entirely by their order. Although it is not related to this topic, if you do not understand the relationship between the new theology of Amun and the breakdown in the Egyptian government, the monotheist revolution which occurred in the 18th dynasty is not going to make any sense to you. The revolution was the last attempt to oppose the priests, who afterwards had almost total control over the country. So we know when the Sphinx was actually repaired, who did it, and why. Egyptian history is already so long, it is sometimes hard to understand the difference between 3,000 years and 10,000 years. This is why, looking backwards at this long and complicated history, it is possible to inflate it into very large numbers. The story from the Dream Stela says the Sphinx was constructed by King Khafre. It says nothing about the Sphinx existing before Khafre, and this stela is much older than the one that was found at the Temple of Isis in Giza. From the earlier Egyptian records, it would appear that the Sphinx is only about 5,000 years old, that it was built by Khafre and repaired by Thutmose IV. After it was repaired by Thutmose IV, the sands grounded away on either side and created the striation patterns that we see today. Even if you were to say that the Sphinx actually is 10,000 years old, and Khafre only repaired it, which is why the head looks good now, and the body has erosion marks on it, you're left with a problem. Why would Khafre repair only the head? That's doing a pretty poor job of it. Adding to the confusion is the fact that we do know that Thutmose IV did repair the Sphinx, and there is a fake stela from the Temple of Isis found in the area that was attempting to artificially inflate the prestige of that specific temple. This is in an environment where Egyptians were attempting to present their civilization to the Greeks as older than it was, in order to protect it. This is where our legends of Atlantis come from. You would think our story would be over, and that we would have settled on a real relationship with the Egyptian texts, and also an understanding of where these stories come from and why they started being told. But there's more to this story, and it involves the interpretations of people from our time, who read the inventory stela and gave it a new twist in its history. The first people who translated the stela were French, and were attempting to compete with the English Egyptologists. Like the Egyptians themselves thousands of years before, they were seeking to engage in a nationalist campaign to claim that their Egyptology, and therefore their culture, was superior to the English Egyptology. For this reason, the Inventory Stela became very popular with French Egyptologists, who liked to claim that not only had Champollion translated the hieroglyphs first, but their understanding of Egypt was better than that of the English, because they had access to documents which went deeper into Egypt's mythic past than the English did. The work of these Egyptologists influenced the French occultist Schwaller de Lubitsch, who was a theosophist, interested in finding links between the Hermetica, a body of magical texts written in Greek said to come from Egypt, and Egyptian wisdom written in the actual hieroglyphic tradition. His principal idea was of the anthropocosmos, an idea that the layout of the Temple of Luxor emerged from the proportions of the human body. While there is evidence that Egyptian art was based on a law of human proportions derived from a set of sacred ratios, de Lubitsch often reads his own ideas into this concept. More often than not, his inferences about the way the Hermetic tradition relates to Egyptian texts involve his own speculations about theosophical connections between religions, rather than engaging with the sources beyond a superficial level. Above all, de Lubitsch's work occurs within the context of a far-right anti-Semitic wing of the traditionalist school, which has been associated with reactionary political movements. Although he was one of the first to reinterpret the Hermetica in the light of new Egyptian discoveries, often his ideas reflected more his own biases than what the texts actually say, similar to many others who attempt to use the image of Egypt to accomplish their own ideological mission. While de Lubitsch did sincerely want to understand the ancients, his own interpolations makes his work a modern misreading, rather than one faithful to their spirit, ultimately playing into Egyptian stereotypes. But his ideas did influence one person, Graham Hancock, who took forward the idea that the Sphinx was 10,000 years old and popularized it in his works. Thus, an idea that began as a project for the priests of Isis to promote the artificial age of their temple was filtered through the nationalism of French Egyptology, picked up by a right-wing occultist, and finally influenced Hancock in his insistence on an ancient technologically advanced civilization. As we can see from engaging with the texts, the real story of how the Hermetic tradition intersects with Egyptian history is more complicated. As we engage with some of these issues in the series that will follow, we are going to explore how Egyptian culture lived on after the end of the country in the form of alchemy and Hermeticism, and look at ways in which Egyptian culture influenced spiritual and cultural practices within Western culture. If this is a topic that interests you, I invite you to check out the video syllabus in this series, which gives you a number of books that you can read about this topic. The goal of this course is to create a new way to understand the spiritual legacy of Egypt, which is more faithful to what the ancients practiced, and also is honest about the ways in which Western culture has borrowed from that country. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and if you found it stimulating, whether you agree or disagree with what I have said here, I hope that you subscribe.